Now, listen, when I was doing some research on you before our conversation, I noticed that you had a really interesting thesis statement about the difference between innovation and invention. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So first, thank you, everybody, for being here in the heat. I think that in order to do that, we first have to ask ourselves, why do we care about innovation, right? We hear about innovation all the time. Everybody wants to be innovative. In order to do that, we have to figure out what innovation actually is. And innovation is not just invention, okay? So to put it simply, invention is the act of coming up with a new idea. Innovation is the act of putting that idea into reality. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the economy, in all stages of production. So from coming up to first to the market ideas, to making them better, to combining them with other things, to figuring out how to produce them more cheaply and reliably, to after service, to how you sell them. And indeed, if you care about the future of the economy, you will quickly realize that what is much more important is not coming up with a new idea. It is actually all the stages after. So remind us that until recently we had COVID. So in COVID, how many of you used Zoom? Exactly. If you and I had to do a video conferencing, which is, by the way, a really old technology, at least 50 years old, even 10 years ago, and I remember having to do it with Korea, we would do anything in our power to avoid that.
Right.
Because you and I would have to go to a specialized room, which will cost millions of dollars, and give to those people a horrible product. And yet, Zoom happened, we click a button, and we all moved online. Reliable product, high quality, and completely change the way we handle this crisis. And even more than that, no one even think about the cost of Zoom anymore. And the reason that happened was not because 50 years ago somebody invented it, or that somebody built a huge room, but because we spent, as humanity, millions of engineering hours, days probably, on improving graphic processors, improving CPUs, improving data communication, improving hardware, to the day that now Zoom is basically like electricity and water. We push the tap, and we have Zoom.
I'm glad you brought up Zoom, because it was really surprising to me. Before the pandemic, I was working remotely, so I used Zoom every day, and it was my first time using it at that job. But during the pandemic, I was really surprised to see everyone adopting Zoom when Skype had already existed in the public sphere for so many years. What did Zoom do how did Skype drop the ball?
Well, Skype dropped the ball because it probably, and I'm sorry if anyone here is from Microsoft, probably they joined Microsoft. And Zoom, by the way, as you might know, you all saw that I had the jacket, come up from a group of engineers that actually left WebEx, which is Microsoft, because they thought it's too heavy, too unintuitive. Actually, WebEx has everything that Zoom has, even better and much more secure, just so hard to use it. And Zoom managed to figure out how to make it useful, simpler, cheaper, and for people like you and me, or at least me, you know, a simpleton like me, I just had to press a button, and it worked.
I'm struggling to see what the difference is, because for me, Skype works exactly the same way. It works the same way as Zoom. It's not, you launch the application.
You probably thought about Skype to make phone calls to one-on-one. Never thought about it. How many of the people here even know that Skype can do what Zoom does and not? It's something you used 15 years ago when you wanted to have cheap phone calls. That's it.
So then Zoom took advantage of the situation, and it's not like they communicated themselves. People just launched onto that. So what was innovative about what Zoom did versus inventive? Because clearly they didn't invent it.
So let's move one stage back.
Okay.
Because I think Zoom is just an example. what really happened with Zoom and with innovation as we know it, it's not just, we have been talking about, just not like first or radical and then improvement, but what also have happened in the world, and again, people didn't realize it, too many people, until COVID, is that we have fragmented the way we produce both goods and services and the way we do innovation into stages. So look at semiconductors.
Okay.
What has happened, if you go to Tel Aviv, Silicon Valley, Seoul, Taiwan, China, all of them have amazingly successful semiconductors industries. Indeed, in almost all of them, the same companies work. So you would think it's the same industry. But then you actually look at what they do in each of those stages, and it's completely different. In Silicon Valley and Tel Aviv, you have companies that come up with new ideas to put on silicon. As all of you know, because for a while you couldn't buy cars, refrigerators, or anything, the only place in the world that know now how to innovate in the production of semiconductors is Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing. In Korea, they focus on specific niches. So every smartphone that somebody buys, no matter what the brand, the second highest profit go to a Korean company. And without China, especially the area around Shenzhen, you wouldn't be able to innovate in producing this, which is tens to 20,000s of components coming from all over the world, constantly changing materials, and you need to somehow make it into this little box. It actually needs to work, and it needs to be in a price that we are willing to pay. So each one of those places, while working on what you might think is exactly the same technology, exactly the same industry, is focusing on being innovative in a very, very specific stage of a production.
So the whole notion of growth is fragmented, and it's sort of it's decentralized, I guess you would call it.
It's decentralized, and I think that you came into a very important point, because geeks like me might be very fascinated by this, but this has real consequences, because in the end of the day, where you focused on which stage also means what kind of jobs you create, to what kind of people, how you pay those people, how you finance the building or whatever you need in order to grow your company. Whether you focus on startups, they employ only very few engineers and run as fast as they can into a financial exit, and who cares whether it create a lot of jobs for everyone around them? Or you focus on stages of production, like in Taiwan, where you need a financial system that allow you to spend, each time you build one factory, several billions, probably $20 billion, but you employ thousands and tens of thousands of engineers and people with different skills and give them an opportunity to actually have good jobs.
So it's not necessarily startup culture that grows the economy and gives it a kick up the ass.
The kick up the ass, they might, because that particular startup culture of Silicon Valley actually create a lot of inequality. And it is needed, right, to come up with new ideas. But if I'm a city or a region and I want to actually have innovation-based growth, what is important for us to understand is that we have many more options, not just, as you said, Silicon Valley, lean startups that kick up the ass but supply jobs to only your elite R&D engineers, their financiers, few celebrity chefs, which are my favorite people, but the rest of the people, which is about 85 to 90% of our population, are on the road to nowhere. This offers them nothing.
I've noticed that you're pretty critical of the whole shine or the image of what Silicon Valley is. Could you tell me a little bit about that? Were you ever a believer and then you got disillusioned? What happened with your perception of it?
So I was a believer. So my very first book was comparing Israel, the growth or innovation based of Israel, Ireland, and Taiwan. And I was all about, wow, look at that transformation. I mean, those countries had nothing, and look what they are now. This must be great, right? As I grow old, speaking about the knees, I also found out that that model, and by the way, that model of Silicon Valley up until the 80s create a huge amount of good jobs, even in California and definitely around California, to people that are not just graduates of Stanford. Something has changed, and together with globalization, and together with the way that the companies that make money by giving money to innovators, in this case, venture capital, change their business model. And what has happened, right, and you could see that in Silicon Valley, right, where you have 10 or 15% of a population, which, as I said, are a graduate of Stanford, Berkeley, MIT, so not the people I would worry about, have unbelievably interesting jobs. They are going to be millionaires, and they got lottery ticket stock options to become billionaires, but nobody else has. And that, I have noticed, happens in other places. So I'm the unofficial historian of what happened in Israel. So on one side, Israel is an amazing story. In '68, the whole private civilian sector had 886 people that did R&D with academic education. So probably less than the people who come to Brain Bar. Almost no R&D whatsoever. And the country was sort of poor. You fast forward it to 2000, and the country has, which is about 6 or 7 million people at that time, has more startups on NASDAQ going IPO than any country bar the US.
How does that happen?
And how did that happen? And that happened thanks to public policy. And that public policy, for whatever reason, says science-based, because nobody knew what high-tech was at the time. Science-based is the future. What we in Israel can do is use our brains, speaking about brain bars, and we will be the place that come up with new ideas to the world. And we will copy the US. But copy the US they did. So on one side now, Israel is the most innovative country on every metric that you want. I won't bore you with numbers, but whatever metric you are, Israel is #1. Unbelievable wealth. On the other side, Israel, in the beginning of a story, was the second most egalitarian society in the OECD. Now it is one of the most unequal. To put it into numbers, 1 of every 5 children in Israel lives in a family that doesn't have enough money to buy food at the end of the month, right next to somebody who has about $1 billion in the bank. So the question that I started, going back to my journey, is, do we have other options? And can we tell about those other options so society and people in other communities will know that they have more options than either Silicon Valley or nothing? And that's what I hope to do.
Yeah, it's so interesting that this little region in Northern California became like shorthand for inventive, growth, cutting edge, future, anyone can do it sort of attitude. And different regions of the world, they call them, oh, we're the Silicon Valley of X, we're the Silicon Valley of Y. But
Let's call them Silicon hyphen.
Sorry?
Silicon hyphen.
Silicon hyphen, right.
Yeah.
And it's like they've tried to do what happened in Silicon Valley without taking into consideration the why, and why that region, who the power players are, and how we can localize those learnings to our cultural situation. Does that sound accurate?
That sounds accurate, and indeed, I think the reason you just described are the reasons why there's another reason not to try to do Silicon Valley, because 99.99% of those attempts end up in a failure. Because you cannot You look at something, you say it worked there, and then you say you don't even check whether the condition that are there is anything that you have, whether you can actually copy some of that stuff. And those are the conditions that were in Silicon Valley and the world in around the 90s, 60s. They definitely are not a condition in Budapest in 2022. So why do you think that something that worked in a world of the 60s, in a completely different culture, with a completely different financial system, completely different labor system, completely different ethos, would work 52 years later in a completely changed world in a completely different place?
That's kind of the problem, isn't it? Because all these like inspiring stories that people like to emulate and share little images of on LinkedIn, they miss a lot of the nuance and the less sexy things about how success happens. But going back to what you were saying about inequality, isn't the inequality that gets created by having an innovative region, it sounds really ugly to say this, but isn't that kind of the price you have to pay in order to have an innovative region?
I would disagree with that. I would say that it's one of those options. And indeed, and it's absolutely fine. Anyone wants to do Silicon Valley. It's very glitchy. It's wonderful. A lot of pictures. You get to have cool stuff. Your politicians can cut a lot of ribbon. Great. But there's a price for it. And the price is massive social dislocation, which means that it's actually not a nice place to live in. And more or less, everybody, apart from the lucky 15%, are going to lose. So you want to go for it. However, there are other models, right? If you look in Europe even, you can look at Finland, a country that was really not innovative. I mean, absolutely not innovative. Just before it became Finland that you and I know today, one of the main master of the economy said that my country should never export anything which is smaller than a horse. And he just thought that what they should do is cut wood and other stuff and ship it to what was then the USSR, and that's it. That's everything that they need to do. And look where they're now. But what more interestingly, look how egalitarian they are compared to what happened to Israel. The same in Taiwan. Taiwan was poor, very unequal. Right now, it's rich, a vibrant democracy, highly creative and innovative. I might say maybe even more so in Silicon Valley on some areas, much more equal. And the reason is, if you want to look at what I call those production stages, right, from stage one, innovation, to final stage, innovation in the production, and through design, you can now look at the world and say there are many entry points in which I can be innovative in many different industries. And that's basically what Taiwan did. Let's see where we can play and where we want to play. And they said, we don't want to be the first innovative, and we cannot compete. Back then there was no China. We cannot compete with Japan and Korea. They have more money, so on massive production. So we will play in the middle. We will become those who know how to innovate in production and control that. And because we now know how to innovate in new production, we can have a lot of startups that might not do the first to the world, but they might look at Silicon Valley and say, oh, this is cool, I can do it much better because the guy next door to me knows how to produce it and produce it cheaply. So what I would say to regions is that you need to figure out where in those stages and in those industries we can play. If you want to, we can talk about luxury shoes instead of semiconductors, and I can give you examples. What do I need in terms of educational system, financial system, to succeed where I want to succeed, so not just copy Silicon Valley? For the state, what roles it needs in order to create those skills, to create what we call public or semi-public goods, and stimulate the entrepreneurs to work this way? How do we link Budapest to the rest of the world, so Budapest get the knowledge and the buzz it needs, and the rest of the world knows that it can get something unique in Budapest, not just another thing they can get anywhere else.
Yeah.
And how has it changed, right? One set of policies work when you have nothing. A different set of policies start to work when you're okay. When you're the most innovative region in the world in your industry, the role of public policy in the states completely change.
Well, I'm glad you're talking about policy and institutions, because what role can institutions play in making sure that you have an innovative hub without having the negative effect of the inequality? What kinds of policy would you like to see entertained more widely?
So I'll repeat myself just a little bit. Let's forget about Silicon Valley for a while.
Okay.
Or if you want to be a place that is in that stage, right, innovating new things, let's forget about the current Silicon Valley model, right, of VCs assuming that you need a financial exit, either public, going on the stock exchange or being bought within 5 years, maybe 3, because that means that you don't care about anything else. Let's forget about that.
Okay.
Now, when you look at those industries, you should not assume that the companies can do everything themselves. So you need to solve what I'm going to be slightly technical, what you call in economics or political economy, problems of public goods, collective action, and coordination, right? So if you want skills and education, you should not assume that companies will suddenly say, oh, I'll solve all the problem of Hungaries and I'll figure out by myself how to create the best universities for the skills, right?
Sounds like Elon Musk.
Yes. The same for the finance. You want capital, and you want capital to move into those models, but you still haven't had anyone that actually made a lot of money in that. So you need to de-risk, what's known as de-risk, and lower the uncertainty, and maybe even put some public money until somebody really become really successful and rich in that, and then other people, we're all greedy, so if you see enough people become rich in doing something which is actually good for society, and you think that you're at least as smart as them, you would also try to do that.
And how do you hold people accountable when you pour money into projects and initiatives? How do you make sure that the growth is always going in, if not necessarily the intended direction, but at least a beneficial one? How do you make sure that?
So first of all, you have to accept that we're talking about innovation.
Right.
There are going to be a lot of failures. So first of all, it fails. And a lot of public money would go to nowhere. At least it seems to be going to nowhere. But remember, we're talking about knowledge. And if that creates knowledge and you keep it in your country or region, second, third, fourth attempt, and we can follow those people, you would find out that your investment that you thought went to the garbage, excuse my language, actually works. But even more importantly, it's not enough to have carrots. You need some sticks. So I'll give you an example. Actually from Israel, which, I've said only bad things about them. Let me say a good thing about them. Israel says we want science, right? And we therefore translated, we want R&D to happen in Israel. But we want it because of spillovers, right? For all of society. And because of that, if you get, and always was the case, you got money from the government to do an R&D and even go to an IPO and become a billion. If the result of that R&D, so patents and all the rest, leave the country, you pay a significant fine. Because the whole idea of getting a public subsidy, public money, is to create positive spillover in Israel. And if what you do in order to make yourself rich is take this result and move it to the US, in the past it wasn't even allowed. Now it's allowed, but you pay up to 6 times more than what you got to the state.
Right.
And the state made sure that it happens. Unlike other places, it's not just in the rule book. Companies that try to do it. Anyone here use Waze, by the way, to navigate? So Waze had, when Google bought them for about $1 billion, they had to pay back to the country 6 times what they got from the country. And that 6 times went straight to the pool that was then given to other startups.
But, so then it's in the developing of patents and broadening local knowledge that local growth happens, or?
So there's a region in Italy called Riviera del Brenta, which is just above Veneto. Any one of you who have high-end luxury women's shoe, and when I mean high-end, it's all the brands that you love, but they should cost at least 500 euros up to several thousand. That shoe, at some point in its life, was in Brenta. And the reason is that Brenta became, for shoes, what Taiwan became from semiconductors. So if you have a designer anywhere, as I said, it's all those brands, you hardly heard about a Brenta brand, have an idea for a shoe, unlike what you see in a reality TV show. It's not, oh, I have this cool shoe, and then 24 hours later, there's a model walking with a shoe. It actually, you need to take this beautiful design and make it into a shoe that a human can use. And if you pay 5,000 euro for that shoe, it really does need to work more than for 2 hours. It needs to look good. It needs to be able to, somebody needs to be able to produce it. Humans sweat, heat. You walk on the shoe. Somebody has to actually make it happen. And what Brenta figured out, and by the way, interestingly, the business leaders of Brenta figured out around the 80s, when they saw that mass production and cheap globalization come from Eastern Europe and then China, is that's where they can build, they didn't have it, a competitive advantage. And then they took the local policymakers and community leaders and together built a constantly changing set of policies. They upgraded the school for the art of shoemaking. So they know how to do things from the wooden thing of a shoe to 3D manufacturing. They connected that school to the best school of designs. So designers from New York come there for a year. The people locally know what will be the next fashion ideas, but when those designers become famous and they want a shoe, the first thing people they call is not somebody in the US or in China. They call their friends from Italy because they know that those people can supply. They create a system of finance. They created a system of shows to the level that now, in Brenta, for 20 years now, huge amount of innovation, huge amount of jobs for people of all skills, from R&D and 3D manufacturers to people who know how to make a wooden stump of a shoe. In multiple small companies that supply all the best names in the world, and there is almost no place in the world that now can compete with the offering that Brenta gives.
So they're expanding their knowledge base, but they're also protective of themselves.
But this is the reason I wanted it. This is not just about patents, and in this case, you can't do a copyright on a shoe.
Right.
And a lot of the official IPR, brands and others, belong to somebody else. But they have a knowledge that nobody else have of how to actually make all of this happen. And because they develop that knowledge, and they develop it in northern Italy, they do now have a quasi-brand. Because every shoe made in Brenta by the Brenta people, I can sell as made in Italy. And some people, fashionable shoes, would be willing to add another 15% of profit or price to that shoe because it's made in Italy and not in Korea.
Yeah, it's a marker of quality.
Exactly.
Now, we have just a couple of minutes left, so I want to switch gears and talk about the future a little bit and kind of get some prospecting from you, if that's cool. What does growth for the economy mean in today's setting, especially in the shadow of the war in Ukraine and COVID? We're still feeling the effect of that, with this other thing now knocked onto it. How can we grow an economy, or are we just retreating to survival now again?
So let me start with a positive and optimistic, because you've been so pessimistic in the sentence, and then go back. So I want to actually be very positive for most places in the world who are not already, Silicon Valley or Israel or Taiwan. What I just described is that there's a lot of opening. But up until COVID, geopolitics, you forgot geopolitics with China,
right.
or in
oh
Ukraine.
My God.
The multinationals and the global market were quite set about the global chain works. You could add yourself into it, but they were very set as to which region they want to put what kind of activities, and it was very hard to get in. Now, they looked around and they basically, oh shit, we want redundancy. I don't think globalization is ending, so I'm not as negative as you are, but we are going to see much more what I call regional networks, or regional networks of production and globalization, together with the global networks. You need to create those regional networks. They don't exist. So places who get their act together now, because there's a window of 3 to 5 years, and especially places that get their act now about industries of the future. So we all talk about green tech. It's lovely to talk about green tech, but at some point it actually has to be made.
Right.
The places that know how to make it. New biomedical, you talked about COVID. So mRNA, just one of an array of new ways to make medicine. So it's not just who comes up with a new medicine, but who comes up with the knowledge of how to make them that are going to win. And there's an opening now. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be horrific. If you're in Ukraine, my heart goes to you. But it's also a time with those of us who are willing to think strategically into the future, wants to win, and understand that winning can have many shapes. And in winning, we want a prosperous, wide shared wealth and prosperity around us with a lot of interesting, challenging jobs for everybody of all ages. There is much more, the chances that we can achieve it are actually now much higher than they were 5 years ago.
I'm picking up on the hopeful part of the cynicism over here. I think that was a lovely note to end on. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Dan Breznitz, everyone. Dan, thank you so much for coming here.
Thank you so much.